I will be recording the session so that I can share it with people who have been unable to join us. We had about 40 people registered, and we'll see how we get on. As in all previous Pimento calls, what I tend to do is put you on mute. If you've got a question at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little chat box there. Please use the opportunity to fire questions during the course of the presentation. This is a panel conversation rather than the presentation as such. So we'll be asking a series of questions to our illustrious panel. And we'll also, if we don't get to you today, if there are any follow-up questions, I'll share them with the team and then we'll get a response to you, if that's okay. Okay, so where are we now? The UK is slowly coming out of lockdown, whilst other countries, notably China, have gone back to a certain degree of normality in April. There are still many open questions as to how consumers and different sectors of their economy and our economy will adjust, how brands should navigate, as we call it, the new normal. Hopefully this afternoon we'll get some answers and see some examples of what's happening elsewhere around the world and be able to compare and contrast that with our own situation in the UK. All three agencies here work extensively with China and the Chinese travelling consumer. That is to say, they operate in the space that advises brands on how to get into China, mainly luxury brands and retail brands, as well as actually how to market in China, and of course, how to market to Chinese people outside of China, including people and venues such as Bicester Village, for example. So, what can we learn from the new China? How does it contrast with North America and the UK? How will consumers, I say, respond? And what are the likely impacts on our own economy as we move forward? Three presenters this afternoon, or three members of our panel. Felicia Schwartz, who is the founder of China Insight. Rainey Hartman, who's sitting there in New York, who's joining us at first thing in the morning. Actually, it's not quite first thing now, is it? It's actually coming up to about 10 o'clock there, I think. And she's the co-founder of China Luxury Advisors, and Gabrielle Shaw, who's the founder of Gabrielle Shaw Communications. Quick profile, if I may. You probably saw it in the invitation, so I won't labour the point. But Felicia has actually gathered a huge amount of experience working in this sector for over a number of years. She's worked at communication agencies such as Ogilvy and Dentsu. She's worked in the native Austria, in France, the US, and inevitably she's also worked in China, where she spent 13 years. And she specialises in strategic planning and consumer insights, as we used to call them in the advertising business, account planners. Currently based in London, that's where she founded China Insight, and she positions her business as a boutique China consultancy. She's joined by a colleague and friend of hers in New York, Rainey Hartman, who focuses on the China market and has done since 2000, with a speciality in understanding and selling into the Chinese consumer. She's worked as a brand owner, retail operator, consumer researcher, marketeer, and market entry strategist in China. And last but by no means least, we're joined by Gabrielle Shaw, who we've just worked out. We used to work at the same agency together, just chatting a moment or two ago. We kind of crossed paths at Dorlands many moons ago. She's built her career as a journalist and advertiser, and before she founded her own business over 21 years ago, and a global strategic and creative agency specialising in retail, beauty and wellness, travel and arts and culture. All of which, of course, I have no idea about any of that. So it's great to have you on board this afternoon, and always up for a bit of culture. So I've had some questions posed to me earlier on, and thank you for those people that were able to send some questions over. I think we'll kick off, if I may. First of all, just make sure that I've got everybody, all the ladies at least, anyway, off unmute. Hang on. There you go. The first question, actually, I'm going to ask Felicia, please. Really interested to understand, really, given obviously China is probably at least a good 4 weeks or arguably 2 months ahead of us here in the UK. And we've seen a return to work, and we've seen them obviously a slight dip. And in Wuhan, I know that they've gone through a program of actually retesting all 11 million people there. But what I'm really interested to understand is really kind of the economic situation there and the consumer trends. What are the major consumer trends in China in general? What is coming out of COVID? How do you think life has changed there?
Yeah, well, first of all, as you said, there seems to be quite a strong recovery in China. So we've all been looking at recovery models. That's been the new thing, right? The V model, the U model, the L model. And China's probably at the moment closest to a V model. So all these economic indicators that people look at, economists look at, metro passengers, energy consumption, domestic travel, property transactions, and unfortunately also air pollution are up again. So cinemas have opened, hotels, sports venues, even Disneyland. The Chinese had a big holiday the first week of May, and domestic travel was quite strong. How people actually feel consumer sentiment, I think Rainey will afterwards also give us some interesting indicator, because she's done a couple of waves of consumer sentiment research in China. But so how are things at the moment? It's interesting, there are 3 devices that are keeping people in check. So people still are supposed to wear the face masks in public. I don't seem to see that that's so much the case. I was actually on the phone with Shanghai this morning because we're running some research there. And there was one person outside a research facility, another one in an office, and no face masks there. But another really interesting device are those health passports. So they're actually apps that sit on your phone. They're obligatory. They were developed in partnership with WeChat and Alipay. And you have to show these apps. They track your movement and some other factors perhaps. And they give you a color, red, yellow, green, according to which you may or not travel. So that's one of these devices that I think we'll never see probably here in the West, because it is quite, there would be privacy issues with that. And interestingly enough, I think we discussed this the other day, this is also linked to the famous social credit system. So if you cheat, if you commit fraud on your health passport, that reflects negatively on your civil credit, your social credit rating. So that's quite interesting. And just to add to that, because these phenomena, of course, very much looked at and criticized in the West, in China, they are not looked upon very negatively or with a lot of fear. And it seems to be that the social contract in China is a bit different, and that people seem to be quite satisfied with how their government has handled the crisis in the later period. And they accept that sort of surveillance in return for feeling safe. So that's where we are now. But I think consumer sentiment is a bit more mixed, and I think Rainey will have some interesting things to say about that.
Thank you, Felicia. Okay, we'll come to Rainey then. On sentiment, what are you witnessing there?
Yeah, we've been running surveys in China since the end of the lockdown, and then we've been doing them about every 2 weeks. So some of the things that we found that have been kind of interesting at the beginning when the lockdown first ended, we saw a big, the trends that were happening were wanting to focus on health, wanting to eat healthy, wanting to exercise both inside and outside, wanting to relax, work on kind of mindfulness and just overall relaxation. And so what we've seen is at the beginning, right after the lockdown, that was the strongest, right? Everybody was more focused on that, less focused on, work, and less focused on school, and more just kind of holistic health. What we've seen over time is that we're starting to revert a little bit more back to normal. So those are becoming less important to people now, and we're seeing things more like, the normal types of things that people are interested in. So I think from a personal consumer sentiment, there was this post-lockdown kind of, I don't know if it was a fear or just sort of this, even when you ask people where they wanted to travel, it was all about relaxation. It wasn't about adventure or going to somewhere new. It's all, I want to go somewhere and relax. And now when we ask people, it's more about, I want to go adventure. I want to do something new. So we're starting to revert back to normal. And I think it's because people have gotten more comfortable with the health situation. People in China really do feel quite safe from the virus. As Felicia said, there's a lot of markers that are happening right now. So we're seeing, I've seen people posting pictures of Shake Shacks opening all over China, and everything's full. People can't even get a seat there, and people are inside eating. Everything is kind of getting back to normal, but it's a different type of normal. Even things like, people go through multiple temperature scans to get into restaurants and to get into the malls, and people have accepted this, as Felicia said, more of these monitors, and people feel comfortable with that. So I think that's something that we've seen on the sentiment side. Although you think everything's going to completely change after, we are seeing people kind of reverting back to their normal behavior. On the financial side, we've seen it actually get worse from China from their sentiment standpoint. So at the beginning, I think they thought like, okay, this was 4 weeks, 8 weeks, we're going to move back to normal and things are going to get better. And then as they've seen the rest of the world, excuse me, the rest of the world get hit by coronavirus, I think from an economic standpoint, there's worries about how that's going to affect the economy. So I think that's taken some time to work out. But I think that from a spending standpoint, although we do see these big blips like Hermes opening a store and having, massive lines outside, you are seeing, the economy is doing pretty well. There are some, people are a little bit concerned about the economy.
Yeah.
On that point, can I go back to Gabrielle? Because I'll ask her a question which relates to that. Because obviously, Rainey, you're sitting there in New York, Gabrielle, you're there in London. And the concept of the new normal being the old normal with a few more safety checks, I find that quite interesting because I was kind of hoping that actually that maybe there would be a change in the way in which we treat each other, the way in which we engage with people, our consumption habits, particularly in the luxury market too, because obviously China's been one of those markets that's been show our wealth, let's flaunt it, let's buy into luxury European and North American brands. Are you suggesting that they're literally going straight back to type with less money but more checks?
Sorry, did you say Gabrielle?
I think we're both Gabrielle and Rainey on that one. So since Gabrielle hasn't spoken yet, should we go to Gabrielle?
I mean, I think it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of change. I think that people will go back to spending, but I don't think it's going to be just picking up where we left off. I think that it's going to be much more thoughtful consumption, and I think they will spend, but they'll be thinking a lot more about, does it mean anything to them? It's not about quantity. I think people will want, whether it's travel, we're seeing a big increase in multi-generational travel or milestone planning for future trips. I think it's all the purchases will be more considered, even if it's at the very top end. And I think that people are looking at brands more carefully too. If you look at consumption even now, there's been a real desire to support British brands over this period and to buy local. At Amazon, I'd be lying if I wouldn't say that Amazon has helped me enormously through this period, be it school supplies or whatever, in this last 3 months. But trying to go to a local supplier, looking at direct to consumer brands, supporting those, thinking more, looking for, I think people care what's behind a brand and what they stand for and how they've behaved in this period, and ones that have shown innovation and agility and have been able to create community where they feel part of. I think those will be where that's where people will spend money, going forward.
Okay, sorry. And do you think, Rainey, that in say North America, obviously, I understand obviously you're a China specialist, but obviously you live in New York and you understand the culture there. That you think that actually coming out of, as beginning to happen in North America and starting to actually get people to go back to work, do you imagine that actually the Americans will react in the same way as the Chinese will in terms of consumption habits and going back to the old normal?
I think it's going to take a long time for North America, for the United States. I think the difference between the U.S. and China is that I think people in China there's several differences. One being that I think most people in China are okay with the government and they're used to the government telling them, how to act in certain ways. So they're, everybody's complying. There's nobody fighting. And granted, it's not that easy to not comply. But still from a sentiment standpoint, people are not that upset about it. They see it as, okay, this is going to make everyone healthier and it's better. In the US, there's huge fights. Half of the country basically thinks that the virus is a hoax and, people are using this as a way to control them. So there's, backlashes against wearing masks. There's backlashes against lockdowns. A lot of people are just going back to normal in their life, regardless of what the government has said, even if things aren't open. There's parties happening. People are starting to, I think the US basically just got bored of the lockdown and decided we're just going to go back out there. So I think, unfortunately, it's going to be a very uneven ramp up because you have certain people who are going out and willing to take the risk and other people who say, because there's no plan, there's no collective approach to it, this is going to make things last even longer. So I think we're going to the US cases are at a plateau. They're not going up, they're not going down. New York is going down, but everywhere else in the US is basically going up a little bit. So it's not super bad, but it's also not going down. You look at there's so many, even in Europe where there is these very, Paris and Spain, where there are these very tight lockdowns. Ours was very loose. So people could go out if they want to. They were told not to, but they could still do it. So I think as a consequence, it's going to be uneven, even when people open up. Doesn't just because a restaurant's open doesn't mean people are going to go to it. So you're going to have restaurants and stores that are open, fully staffed, but their capacity is going to be much lower. So I think from a profitability standpoint, it's going to be really hard for businesses to bounce back right away.
Yeah. Partly, obviously, in the UK, we're seeing a similar situation, and it tends to be driven by age in some cases, social background, where people live, and the level of their desperation and need to get back to work, which obviously is driving certainly a split in some respects between those people that can't afford not to go back to work and having to go back to work and making difficult decisions. I guess in China, when the schools were opened, you didn't have that level of dissent because everybody does what they are told to do. Did you see anything there, however, in the sentiment survey coming through that parents were at all worried about sending their kids back to school?
I mean, I think that parents, have been worried, and schools were one of the last things to reopen in China. So you had, people went back to work for a month or so. They had the malls open, the subway. So they had quite a lot of time before schools went back. So it was probably the last major thing to open back up. So I think that has given people some assurances. And even when you see pictures in China, the kids are all wearing masks. There's a couple great pictures going around where they put these old sort of ancient headwear that had these balloons that popped out. So they had 6 feet so kids could tell how far to get away from each other. So they have made definite changes at the school. But I think by nature of the careful reopening and having it come so late, I think people did feel fairly comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, if I may chime in, so some people went back to work in China as early as mid-February, and the schools in Beijing just opened last week. So there was a huge difference. But I think even in China, the new normal is not quite normal. So what Renee has been saying in terms of the economic impact, I think what's happening in the rest of the world is also really worrying the Chinese at the moment. And we see this young generation, Z, Y, and they are really the motor of the Chinese economy, right? These young millennials. And they have been really quite hedonistic. I mean, spending like there's no tomorrow, spending next month's paycheck, and that's not the sentiment anymore. So a lot of these millennials are now saying, well, wow, this was the first economic shock that happened to them in their lives. With whatever is going on, there has been personal impact. Some companies in China also closing, and who knows how this is going. The ripple effect has not completely landed there either. And with what's happening in the world as well, there might be some repercussions back to China. So for the first time in a long time, we're hearing young people who want to save money. So a lot of talk about on social media and in interviews about more restrained lifestyle, not spending just right, left, and center anymore. And in terms of brands, choosing brands that are, so yes, we're still going to buy, but we're going to buy quality, we're going to buy when the price is right, and a much more restrained, post-aspirational buying pattern, if we can call it that. So of course, this already started before COVID-19. So at that point, I even wrote an article about minimalism in China, definitely more conscientious consumption, less logo-oriented, more into the purpose of the brand. But this has sort of like been really, really accelerated because of COVID-19.
That acceleration in purpose, obviously, but we're seeing that everywhere, I guess. Have you, in terms of what's happening with some European brands versus local brands, are you seeing a change in consumption habits there? Are people more like to buy China than they are to buy European brands?
Yeah, I would say, again, I would say in general, it's a polarized picture. So we cannot say that luxury is completely down during COVID-19 because some brands benefited and some didn't. I think there's been a huge polarization, and some international brands are still doing very well. Like L'Oreal actually had a +6% for the first semester, year on year. So smack during the COVID-19 period. So they obviously managed to perform really well online. So to work the digital element in their favor. Of course, it's also a category that's more that people still consume. Of course, that has something to do with it. Local brands like Perfect Diary, which is a Chinese makeup brand, also did very well. So there are winners and losers, both international and Chinese. Yes, there has been some growth of the national sentiment. The Chinese both were quite proud at how China dealt eventually with the virus, and also there's been a sentiment that we need to support our local brands. But again, this is just an acceleration, as you said, of a trend that already started before COVID-19. So these young consumers grew up in an era where there were some Chinese brands that were actually performing quite well, as opposed to their parents, where anything made in China was poor quality, and international brands had this immense aura. So Chinese young consumers are proud of China, they're nationalistic, they see the quality of Chinese brands, and so on that basis, they would happily buy Chinese, but Chinese brands, just like international brands, have to cater to this very digital, very experience-hungry young consumer. So for example, Perfect Diary had this amazing cooperation with the Met Museum in New York, and they showed their new color range, comparing it to different paintings and different works of art that they were inspired by. So, people buy the brand because it's inspirational, it's creative, and it's Chinese. There's a lot of components now that have to be right for the Chinese consumer.
Okay, what I propose we do in a moment is open it up to questions from across everyone in the room. They can ask those questions live, but before, I'll give them a couple of minutes to gather their thoughts. How is communication changed through this period? Are we seeing brands communicating differently during COVID and post-COVID? And it's to any one of you. I mean, who's best positioned to
I think for that one, we're finding the first piece since this started has been that brands are really taking a look at, how do I get my house in order? Am I relevant right now as a brand? Is the architecture of my brand right? So we have been doing a lot of work. We have a sustainability and purpose practice, but we've had a lot of people saying, how do I use this time right now to make sure when we start moving out of lockdown that we're absolutely resonating? And I think communication it's been incredibly important. One, in terms of tone. Once you've got the right, you're communicating the right things. Second piece is tone. You've got to be bang on target right now for how the world is changing. Empathy is a huge part of that, but also staying true to who your brand is, not looking like you're trying to ride this situation in terms of being opportunistic. And I think stakeholders are incredibly important right now. A lot of brands have focused very much on who are their end consumers. And right now, that's really, really changed in equal proportions. They need to be speaking to their end consumers, but they've more than ever have not needed to speak to their supply chain. Those are the people that have allowed them to get their product in these times, to actually retool, to be able to completely change their business models in some instance right now, how they can get their product into the hands of people they may not have been able to get their hands into. The sustainability is a huge part of that too. So they also have to be closer to their supply chain because that matters to people right now. So a lot of them have taken an opportunity to look at that, looking at actually how they make changes to be more local as well. And then, obviously there are other stakeholders, be it, how the media is seeing them. Brands are really being judged during this period of how they come out of it, how do they build community. And we've also really seen a lot of opportunities where some brands have done incredible things to build community around in a way that they've never done before. So a lot of them taken a lot of chances in terms of, how do I really dial up my social media in a different way than I've done before? We're also seeing a lot of brands collaborating in terms of how they're communicating. One, because it gives them the opportunity to reach new audiences very cost effectively. It also allows them to say things that they can't say about their brand themselves by having a third party collaborator, and a lot we're seeing, especially in the area of the arts, where, you are doing something good for the community right now. Arts organizations are really struggling. A lot of their funding will have dried up. But it also allows somebody to talk about your brand, often to a newer audience, especially one that in a lot of instances with the arts that targets younger audiences, Gen Z, and millennials, which is incredibly important for a lot of brands right now. So we're seeing a lot of people actually really innovating because they've had to. It's the only way they could communicate. And they started with kind of feeling their way through this, but a lot of them have grown they've had 3 months to get quite confident in that space, and those communities will stay with them. And again, that's really differentiated them from a lot of their competitors, I think, during this period. So that's been a really collaboration between, brands. One of our clients is American Express. They're helping do signage for their shop small program. Retailers that would never have been able to go out in this kind of, it would be hard for them to get signage done quickly to return to work quickly, because that's happening in the next weeks. A lot of stores are starting to open up. How do they be ready for that? And a lot more collaboration and cooperation, which has been really nice to see.
Gabrielle, one of your clients I know is Bicester Village, and David had a question related to how they've had to change their proposition in order to be able to maintain their relationship. David.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, firstly, when do you think China will start traveling again, or be allowed to travel again? And will they, of course, will they want to travel? And clearly, the Chinese market has been quite influential up at Bicester, for example. I mean, they're big spenders up there. How do you see, well, generally the travel market, but particularly, Asia coming back to Europe and coming back to the UK?
I think that China is definitely, to answer that question in a couple of parts, I think China is definitely starting to travel again. We work with a very high-end travel company called White Desert, and they're an Antarctic travel business. So I have to say that's about the safest planet on Earth right now, part of the Earth right now, because there is no COVID-19. But people are being much more focused to bigger milestone trips. They're planning further out. Those sorts of trips, we're seeing bookings coming in for October onwards. So I don't think they're planning for the summer necessarily. But so there is movement in that space. I think it's at the higher end of the market. I think businesses like Bicester, they're in a very fortunate position that they can look to what's been happening in their global business. They can look at what's been happening in China. They're now open again in China and pretty much across Europe now. So they've been able to take those learnings, but they've worked incredibly quickly to bring in very, very new protocols to totally change the way their entire villages work, in terms of, a lot of them here, for instance, Bicester is very much a destination where people go by train. They've had to accommodate the swap to people who are going to be driving more. Things you would never have seen in retail happening, when people would be looking at, the is always to get to people come to store. How do you communicate with really valued customers and create ways for them to shop without being there physically? Whole range. How do you look at, something like Bicester it's shopping, but it's actually also very much a destination. It's the second visited destination in the country, behind Buckingham Palace. So when you look at that, they're not just going for shopping, they're going for a day out. They're going to see Oxfordshire. They're going for the food and drink, because they have amazing food and drink offerings. So that piece is, you have to take that and accommodate. How does that move outside, or how do you reshift all of that? And part of something like a Bicester Village would be, again, people go for big chunks of time, which is part of its success. They have a much bigger dwell time than a lot of other businesses. So all those things are part of that equation. I think they've had to really look at their audiences. It's definitely a business that has China as part of it, Middle East. The UK is very broken down into different people, whether you've got Oxfordshire, Londoners, and then you've got bigger tourism from UK itself. And they're going to have to look at that, or they are looking at it, and shifting their focus, because the China piece it's going to be a while before that comes back. And they've had to be really adept at making it relevant and really, really focusing on the safety elements. In a lot of respects, something that's outdoor shopping, I think would be more resonant, at least to me, than necessarily being in a confined space and stored in a mall.
Thank you. You spoke about the travel market, and obviously the tendencies for travel is evolving in terms of taste and things that people want to do in China. One of our clients is Celebrity Cruises, and 3 years ago they decided to reposition a number of their ships to the China market from Europe. Currently, their global fleet of something like 30 odd ships have been mothballed, and getting people back onto cruise liners, I think, is going to be one of the more difficult challenges within the travel sector, but nonetheless not impossible. The style of travel then obviously is changing, but you were talking about the affluent and their ability to travel more frequently and to travel to more exotic destinations. But do you sense that amongst the younger people, that there's likely to be a change in their requirements when it comes to travel?
I mean, I think generally on travel, we're seeing a lot of people, they've had a lot of time at home. So on the one hand, I think they're itching to get out, but I think there's a huge appreciation what we have at our doorsteps. And I think people discovering Britain in a different way, and driving, I think driving is going to be the one that seeing the research, driving is going to be the thing that starts moving first. And I think people are going to be more appreciative that things that are closer, I think they'll feel more comfortable being able to have a lot more control over things. And I think that the air travel is going to be at the latter end of that piece. What the evidence we do see of some of the people when people are flying, on the one hand, there aren't very many flights, but the ones that seem to be flying, they don't seem to be socially distanced at all. They seem to be very limited flights with actually fairly full flights to keep them going. I think that's quite a barrier. And I think the younger, some of the things I think will definitely play into some of the younger travel is some of the things like festivals and things. And there's been unbelievable creativity how some of those are being repurposed and redone, but you can't entirely replace some of those experiences. That would be definitely a very big part of this next season, apart from people going to Europe. And that's going to be a long haul on some of that. And I think there's been some businesses have been very clever about that. If you look like people like Belmont, they're selling, you're selling tomorrow time, and they're getting people to buy vouchers. And some brands have been quite smart about how they capitalized on that. But there's a long way to go on that, and that's going to be one of the toughest hit industries for sure.
Thank you. So Andy's got a couple of questions for Felicia. Andy, do you want to jump in here?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. So we've all got Zoom literate. Will the Chinese blend their business behavior with a mixture of Zoom and travel for doing business, as it were, in the way we've all had to rather quickly adapt and adopt it? How will the Chinese fare on that?
I think it's interesting, but humans are in a way very similar everywhere, because we're talking about human behavior. And so studies show that about 45% of our behavior is ritual, so we don't even think about it. So we go about it, and then something comes and disrupts it, and we get into a new ritual. And then if that lasts for long enough, or if we see that it replaces the other ritual quite well, more economically, etc., then we stick to the new one. And I think the world of work is completely in that situation anywhere in the world, including in China. So yes, people are back to the office now, but I'm sure that a lot of long haul travel people will think carefully, especially now, of course, there's very little long haul travel back, but even in the future, they will think more carefully. Can we just do it online? Now, will it be Zoom? The Chinese, of course, always have their own line of other technology, so Ding Talk and just different platforms that have been developed by the Chinese giant tech companies will be the ones. But definitely, so I think this will happen in work hugely. So distance remote working, and also in education. So like everywhere, education went online in China, but in China also, much more than in the West, people love giving their kids all these extra classes because it's a very competitive society.
Yeah.
And for example, English online has boomed during COVID-19. So I think a lot of that will also continue. So education online, even if kids go back to school, and they're back to school now, all the extracurriculars a lot of that might stay online.
Yeah, and a couple things just to add on that real quick. Zoom before COVID, Zoom was always actually pretty good in China. It was one of the few conferencing services that actually worked with China. What we've been seeing is it's starting to get worse, which means that the government's starting to block it more. And like Felicia mentioned, we're seeing a big rise in local solutions for that. So Ding Talk, which is the Alibaba. One interesting thing, we work quite closely with Tencent, and they had a product called Tencent Meeting, which is basically like Zoom as well, which nobody really used before COVID. And now all of a sudden you saw, massive spikes in Tencent meetings to the point that people are using it all the time now. So I think we're seeing, and Tencent just launched a new product which is more focused on helping overseas companies communicate with China now. So they did launch an overseas part of that as well. So we're seeing more of the local Chinese carriers realizing, and the local Chinese companies realizing this is a huge business if they can control it. So we're starting to see more local companies doing that. So they're definitely going to be the ones that are going to win in China.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, we work with a lot of DMOs, like destination marketing organizations and tourism, state tourism boards and things like that. And one of the big parts about tourism marketing is trade shows, right? And sales missions, meeting people. So especially in China, that's a huge part of tourism marketing. So all of that's gone online. So it's all about, they're using WeChat to do live streaming. People are doing a lot of things like this, like trainings and Zooms. People are starting to gamify it a little bit to make it more interesting. So you can take quizzes and win prizes, and how you take that face-to-face meeting that you used to have and then bring that to an online environment. I think that's going to be the trend for at least the next year, because it's real. Nobody's going to be going to China for road shows for a while. And I think what's going to be leading that from the China, someone asked earlier about when China is going to start traveling. I think it's going to be very case by case and country by country. So China's already traveling domestically. How China opens that up, before the lockdown, before they had a really tight lockdown, they had tiered countries according to how well they had contained the virus. So if you got a yellow, green, or red, if you came in from a green country, you didn't have to quarantine. If you came in from a yellow country, you might have to quarantine. If you came from a red country, you definitely have to quarantine 2 weeks in a hotel. Or if you had a house there, you can, depending on certain things, they would come in, inspect your house, make sure you had a dedicated bathroom if you want to quarantine at home. And if you did quarantine at home, everybody had to quarantine at home. So you're making these choices that if you do take a trip, you got to plan for 2 weeks on the back end to quarantine if you're going to go somewhere that's a little bit more risky. So you're going to see people change that. And I think the other thing that's going to play into that, it's going to get a little political. So the more that countries such as America are starting to blame China for the coronavirus, the tougher that's going to be to kind of, bridge that gap. So I think there is going to be some political nuances that come in as well.
Rainey, I'd like to come back to the political point in a moment, but if I may, I bring in Jack Lewis from London Advertising. London are a global agency based in London, principally in communications, advertising being their kind of core discipline. They work with luxury brands around the world. Jack.
Hi, thank you. So my main client is Mandarin Oriental Hotel Group. So this question kind of has a focus on luxury and travel. So before COVID, the idea of luxury was changing in China. So how has COVID impacted on this? So for example, will we expect people to have more of an affinity with exclusivity or experiences? Will we see peaks in group travel as people have spent time in lockdown? So what will people expect from a luxury brand moving forward?
I would say that, well, in general, the trend has definitely been towards experiential. So that's something that COVID is not going to change. And I wonder, how, as Renee said before, definitely after COVID, immediately, we saw a huge surge towards well-being, nature, sort of that sort of kind of direct result of COVID-19. I wonder whether that is going to stay a trend. But experiential is very strong. So a need for exclusive experiences. Nature has always been a part of that. So of course, a lot of the Chinese cities are extremely crowded, are polluted. So yes, there's definitely part of that that's always been nature is exclusivity, space is exclusivity in China, but also culture, art, all sorts of experiences, and especially amongst young people. And so it's interesting, even when young people, we've done some research with young people when they, so some students who study in the UK, and what do they take their parents and relatives to do when they come here? And there were some really things that you would never imagine, like some sort of crab festival by I don't know what shore, but what seaside, and going to visit the Downton Abbey stately home, and things that are quite far-fetched, because a lot of the ones who travel a lot have done the regular things, and there are extra bragging rights. If on your WeChat and all your other social media, you can show something really, really special that you did and nobody else has.
Yeah, this just reminded me of one funny thing that I had seen You know, in California, there's an area called Palos Verdes, which is this very gorgeous multi-million-dollar homes. Everyone has a view all on a hill. And I met a Chinese family that was quite wealthy, and they had moved there and they bought 2 lots together, which are already very expensive lots, and they recreated Downton Abbey to the thing where they had the servants lived underneath as well. So they also had like a team of servants that lived underneath. They had a west wing and east wing. They, you know, 2 Teslas, the whole thing. But it was fascinating just to hear like Downton Abbey to the point where people actually are recreating it, and it's not cheap. This is a very, very expensive location they were in anyway. So I think it is interesting to see those types of experiential things that come out. And I think you know, one of the other things we're seeing with travel, you know, it's kind of, I think Felicia and Gabrielle were saying this earlier, that you're seeing trends that are already happening getting expedited. So one of the things that was already happening is a big change in the way people travel. So, you know, a lot of people, when you think of Chinese tourists, you think of like, okay, they're all coming on a bus, they're all part of a group, they're wearing hats and flags, and they're part of these big groups. We're already seeing a huge trend towards people traveling either in smaller, more like, you know, elite groups, or traveling on their own. So we work with the state of Arizona. One of the big attractions is the Grand Canyon. So we get the route. So we put in at one of the rest stops in the route from Las Vegas to Grand Canyon, which is where almost all Chinese tourists through US go through that route. We actually put a QR WeChat survey up there, and we gave people a pin. They would just basically take the survey, show somebody they got it, and they got a little like Route 66 pin. And what we found out is that about 80% of the people coming through there were driving themselves. And that was just blowing everybody's mind, because they thought if you ask everybody there, they're like, they all come on buses. But no, people are renting cars, driving themselves. And I think this is going to expedite that even more, because the last thing you probably want to do is be in a closed bus with a lot of people. You'd much rather go rent your car and have control over it. You know, in the US, one of the big trends this summer is RVs, because people can have a self-contained house, and then you don't have to go use the bathroom when you're traveling, and you can have that full control. So I think the individual travel is going to change. Was already a trend, but it's going to expedite. And that also tends to tailor more towards luxury. People are much more likely to spend more on 4- and 5-star hotels. They want to spend more on dining. They want to spend more on experiences. And you know, what is suffering a little bit from that is a bit of the shopping. So it used to be like, come stay at 2-star hotels, go eat Chinese food the whole time, but spend a ton of money on shopping. That is starting to change a little bit. So people are going more towards the experiential. So good for Mandarin Oriental, a little bit tougher for Bicester. But you know, there's no lack of shopping no matter what, though.
And Bicester has even seen a trend towards that before this. You know, everybody says traditionally that the Chinese will come in, they'll come in big groups, and they are more tour oriented. For probably the last 5 years, there's been a real trend to people coming on their own, and changing up and trading up in where they're staying and how they're visiting the UK. And there has been a big cultural piece where if they want to come to destination, they do want to tick off. They want to come, for instance, to Bicester. They want to go to Blenheim Palace. They want to see a bunch of, you know, things that are very, very English. They love the Cotswolds, you know. So those things have been there for a while.
If I can just add, I think it just came to my mind that probably one of the reasons why why Chinese are also more confident and into the society phenomenon, but travel in China has gone totally tech. And so from planning the travel to booking to everything, there are apps and travel sites in China. And so technology plays such a huge part in making travel easier for the Chinese. So that's, I think, a huge factor. And also, I think for people who want to work with the Chinese and attract Chinese, they really need to adhere to those social media and websites and what have you.
Yeah, and one thing I just add on to that, I think that's going to be one of the key trends that we see post-COVID, right? How do you integrate technology into the shopping experience? And China's always been quite good at that. They've always been ahead of where most of the West has been. But I think we're going to see that accelerate. You know, in the US, one of the things that's proven to be very popular is Target. Target, which I think most of you guys know it, is kind of like a sort of a high-end superstore. But basically they have an app, and you can go pick what you want on the app, you pay for it, and you click drive up. And so you basically drive up, pop your trunk, they put the bags in your car, and you drive away. You don't have to talk to anybody. You do have to show a QR code. You show like a barcode. But besides that, there's no interaction. So I think that's going to be an area, the contactless shopping is going to be a huge trend. We work pretty closely with Alibaba, and they're actually launching a service this year, partly in response to COVID, where you can basically, and it's targeted to Chinese travelers. And what they do is you can buy on their app ahead of time. You put a little store on their app. You can buy for the consumer buys. They use their Alipay. They use their Alipay account. They buy it, and then basically it's basically pick up and buy and pick up. So essentially they've already bought it, they've already got everything, they just need to go to the store, pick it up, and then leave. So places like duty free, this is going to be a huge game changer for duty free, where people don't have to spend that time. They generally know what they want anyways. So instead of spending all that time in the store, jostling into people and touching things, they're going to buy it ahead of time, pick it up, and take it on the plane. They don't even have to talk to anybody. So I think that's going to be an area that we're really going to see changes. And I think that's where the West can learn some things from China in terms of that's what the consumer is going to want right now. Even in the US, we're already seeing a huge trend towards that of pickup and contactless. So I think that's going to be an area where you can integrate the technology in is going to help tremendously for the retailers.
And we're seeing some of that happening for reopening here coming. And, you know, on the one hand, you can say it seems like there's a lot less touch points, but some of the great things about some of that is it allows, especially in the upper end of the market, people to develop great relationships they might not have had in the same way. You know, some of those things, a video call with a brand, talking to them, you know, somebody actually getting to know you, asking what you like, almost virtually shopping with you. And there's a lot more of that stuff starting to happen. And that's going to change things in terms of loyalty in some ways that it's a remote relationship, but also in some respects can be quite a lot deeper. And it's incredibly helpful and allows them to pick up that conversation that might have been somebody coming into store, but now all of a sudden it can escalate to somebody saying, well, we shopped with you last week. You know, the opportunity for that salesperson to call up, you know, a really valued customer is much better right now because it's helping them in a way that they never would have done for them before.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about, obviously, particularly the luxury sector. And we've got a few other luxury brand and sales executives on this call. I hope they don't mind if I bring them in, because I'd like to get a question, if I may, from Michaela from Bloomingdale's. And I also believe, Jacqueline, you're from the Dorchester collection. I'd be interested in how you've changed as your approach in trying to attract Chinese money, if you like, back into your hotels. Michaela, could you tell me a little bit about where you're based?
Hi everyone. Actually, I'm based in Shanghai, and we opened the office 6 years ago and try to target the high-end travelers, especially to the US and European market, because where our hotels are located. But according to this situation, the global crisis now, to be honest, the agents in China actually suffer a lot for this global crisis, and no people starting traveling overseas at this moment, depending on the flight restriction and also some lockdown from the other countries. But still people start, as everybody shared, people start to travel within the country, but still some policies that especially for group travel and also for some MICE business, it's not allowed to travel like over province to the other provinces. But individual travelers, I would say, especially for, I'm not sure everybody knows a place called Sanya. It's very south of the country. The business, especially in the May holiday, the Sanya hotels is really fully booked, because many people, especially the individual travelers, go there. So I would say people want to travel, but it depends on the conditions of like tours and also the policies of other countries. But
thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Jacqueline, I don't know whether you're UK based, are you?
No, I'm based in Shanghai, but recently I'm in United States.
Okay, so do you work out of one of your hotels in the US selling inbound to China?
No, I'm working for the Dorchester Collection Group to sell all the property to the Chinese travelers when
In the
they,
US?
yeah.
So like the Beverly Hills and other such beautiful hotels.
Beverly Hotels and also Dorchester in London.
Yeah.
And Le Maurice and Plaza Athénée in Paris. And we also have 2 hotels in Milan, Principe di Savoy and Hotel Eden in Rome.
Terrible collection of hotels, absolutely terrible. But I feel for you. It's going to come back very rapidly. And actually, my local is around the corner, so we're very lucky. We're just 5 minutes from Calworth.
Oh yeah, that's great. Actually, Chinese
there
people.
At the moment. I'm conscious that the time is marching on, and I'd like to thank the panel. There's been some very interesting insights, and I guess it feels that actually China is not just 2 months ahead, but in many respects, it feels like it's a long way ahead of what's happening elsewhere in Europe, both in terms of its application of technology, its recognition of the need to track and monitor people. I mean, the UK will probably get around to that sometime next year by the time they get the app through. There's going to be a lot of resistance before we get very far with that concept. But I'm also kind of upset in a way, because I was rather hoping that one of the things that would come out of COVID would be a more physical, more emotional, a larger change, I guess, than a return to the old normal with a few sort of safety checks. Let's see what happens. I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens also with our friends in North America and our favourite person in the entire world, President Trump, and how he solidifies or doesn't the relationship with China, and what impact that will have both on the Chinese economy and what could obviously happen in terms of China's ability to travel, as you said earlier on. As goes away as quickly as it started. But I'd like to thank Felicia, I'd like to thank Gabrielle, and I'd like to thank Rainey for getting up really early in the morning in New York. I'd like to thank our callers in Shanghai and everyone else who's joined us. I will make available a copy of today's presentation should you want one. And if there's anything else we can do to support you at Pimento or through the agency, do drop me a line. I think you've got my email address, but if not, it's stephen.knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, at pimento.co.uk. So I'm allowing you 5 minutes to get to your next call. So I hope that's okay with everybody. And thank you once again. Goodbye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Stephen.
Thank you.